Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I had the distinct honor and privilege of being able to interview Joe and Gay Haldeman. Joe Haldeman is the author of The Forever War, one of the most acclaimed science fiction books of all time and one of my personal favorites. Joe and Gay are both very well read in science fiction, and we had a wonderful conversation about the Forever War and the way that science fiction has changed over the decades. Unfortunately, due to Wi-Fi issues, the video and the audio are a bit desynced at times, and I had to patch it up a bit. But I hope you all are ready to enjoy my conversation with Joe and Gay Haldeman. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. It is a pleasure to meet both of you, Joe and Gay. I'm just really excited at this opportunity. I actually read The Forever War for the very first time this year, so I was very eager to talk to you both about it, as well as just kind of your experiences in general with writing and sci-fi and all that sort of stuff. So thank you for joining me.
Sure.
Yeah. I loved the review, by the way. You did a wonderful YouTube review of The Forever War.
Yeah, it was good.
Excellent
Thank
review.
you. Thank
I'm not
you
biased
very
or
much.
anything.
Well, thank you very much. That means a lot. And that video is actually the best performing video on my YouTube channel right now. So I'm very grateful to you all as well in that respect. So
good.
All right. Well, to kick us off, I had written down some questions on my phone, so I'm just kind of going to be reading off of that a little bit. But to start us off, I wanted to ask about some kind of general background information, if you don't mind me playing therapist for a moment and asking what was y'all's childhood like?
Short. Well, my childhood was a little more complicated than most. As my father was a public health officer, and we lived in Alaska most of my childhood, but also in Puerto Rico and in the air, things like that. I had a much more interesting childhood than adult life. So then I got out of grade school and life became dull.
So he went to a high school dance and met me.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yes, that was actually going to be my next question, was how did the two of you meet and what was kind of your story of how the two of you got together?
Well, I went to a dance and needed a girl.
I went to the dance. Neither of us wanted to go to the dance. Yeah. It was a Valentine's Day dance, but neither of us, we both worked on it behind the scenes, so we felt we had to go. And
so that's sweet.
And we met at the dance.
Like all great storybook romances, it was random.
Yeah, that's fair.
I was 15 and he was 17, and we've been together ever since.
That's awesome. That's really great. And also kind of moving from there, I wanted to ask for you, Joe, specifically, when did you start getting into writing and when did you start learning that you had a love for writing fiction?
Actually, probably before I was 10 years old.
Yeah.
I was drawing cartoons and comic strips on the tablets my father brought home from the office before I started grade school. And
Gotcha.
Never stopped. And I'm still at it.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I think I find with most people that that it occurs at a young age, that they start reading books as a kid and then they start kind of imagining, well, what if I did something kind of like this?
Yeah. You know, conversely, the most interesting early writing stories are people who didn't do it when they were kids, who just started writing, say, in their teen years or 20s. And what kind of a person would do that?
Yeah. Gotcha. And what drew you to science fiction specifically as kind of your genre of choice, if you would?
Well, the choice was made very early. I just started reading science fiction books that a woman brought to me because I liked them. And she was my grade school teacher's daughter.
Mm.
And she was like 17, 18 years old. And I guess had a kind of a mother instinct. But she brought me all these books, and I just kept asking for more. And these were the Winston Juveniles, which is young adult science fiction that was printed in the 50s and 60s.
But he was in third grade.
I was in third grade. Yeah, they didn't. Most of people who were actually teachers or in teachers' families knew that grade didn't have much to do with reading ability or reading interest. So yeah, she just they gave me textbooks all the way up through college, and if I wanted them, I read them, and if I didn't, I didn't read them.
The third grade teacher caught him reading when he should have been paying attention in class. And she took the book away from him. And then at the end of class, she said, "Here's the book back. I'll bring you some more if you promise not to read them in class." And then her daughter loaned him a whole bunch more.
Yeah. And I learned how to read with a book in my lap again, kind of looking down every now and then.
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty good problem to have with your students if you can't get them to stop reading.
Yes. And luckily she was smart and she realized that.
Yeah. Yes, and I think we often underestimate with children just how much they are able to comprehend beyond the level we typically assign them. Like I read like 1984 when I was in early high school, and it blew my mind, and it opened my mind to all these other books. And I think a lot of people have similar stories of reading books pretty young that weren't necessarily intended for young audiences, but it kind of opens you up to more adult, if you will, genres. Also, talking about writing and getting into reading, I wanted to ask, I had seen from another clip of an interview, Gay, wasn't it Joe who got you into reading science fiction? Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah. We had started dating, and really early I was a reader, but I didn't know science fiction. And he handed me Expedition to Earth by Arthur C. Clarke. Said he'd read this. So I read it. I loved it. I didn't know it was a test, but it was a test. And so I love science fiction, and I've been reading it ever since. I read more of it now than he does.
Yeah, because I know
that's awesome. That's great. Yeah, I have to say for myself that it definitely helps if the person you are interested in also has very similar commonalities with you in terms of reading and the kind of media that you both enjoy.
And all his good friends and read science fiction. They were all pretty cohesive around their science fiction.
Yeah, the word didn't really exist in our universe, but we were all fans.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we all went to the World Science Fiction Convention in 1963 together.
Yeah.
Ooh, nice.
On that. Go to a lot of conventions.
That's great. That's great. And I actually have a question about that later on. And I wanted to ask for you, Joe, with the Forever War specifically, what was the process like of writing it? Did you feel like it came very naturally? Did you really struggle with how do I get this story out? What was that like?
No, I just sat down and wrote. You know, I came out because that was the one big dramatic thing that had happened in my life. So of course that I would write that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It's kind of funny to me because a lot of people nowadays will say you're not supposed to do like author self-insert characters for stories, but I think the Forever War works because it's like, well, your experiences are so interesting that it's totally fine if the author inserts himself into the story because it's interesting. So,
well, you know, I would, as an ex-writing teacher, I would say, well, yes and no. A really boring person can't write an interesting life story. I don't care what he's done. I mean, if he's just sat in a room and taught retarded children, he could be a great novelist. But he could be a well-read, brilliant man who has no talent, and he couldn't write up a grocery list that you'd want to read. That's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
It's not something everyone can do, but that's not to say that it's difficult. It's just, I mean, I couldn't teach a room full of retarded children, and you know, that takes effort as well as genius.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I think that's a very good point. And along those same lines, talking about the Forever War and how it got to publication, I read in the author's note for the edition of the book that I got that the Forever War was pitched to 18 different publishers before it was picked up. I mean, I wanted to ask, what was that like? Were you very discouraged by that? What were kind of your feelings on that?
I thought that it was extreme. I mean, I knew other people whose books were being published, and I didn't think that my idea was that stupid. You know, if you read books about writing, one of the things they tell you first of all is just don't give up, because the whole world is against you, but it was against everybody. And so, you know, you just stick to it until you finally make it.
And then Ben Bova started publishing pieces of the book in Analog magazine. Yeah. And we thought that would help the book. Then we went to Joe's agent, who showed him the 18 places he'd sent it and said, I don't know what to do now. So we went to a cocktail party, and Ben Bova, the editor of Analog, was there, and he said, well, let me introduce you to this guy who's a editor, but he doesn't publish science fiction. And that was Tom Dunn at St. Martin's Press, who was interested in the Vietnam War. So he said, send it to me. And also had a few drinks. and he bought it right away. Without Ben, I don't know what would have happened.
Yeah, that's true.
And without Tom, I don't know what would have happened.
Gotcha.
So it helps to know people.
I bet. I bet it does. And do you think, were people rejecting it just because they thought it was too controversial of a subject, or were they not really interested in sci-fi? What do you think was kind of their reasoning?
I mean, nobody liked people were against the Vietnam War, and against war and the Vietnam War specifically. So here comes a book proposal from a nobody author about a science fiction novel based on Vietnam, and they say, you know, they didn't have to read the second paragraph. They go, oh, screw this. But there are a couple of editors who said, you know, everybody else is going to say screw this, but I'm going to say, give me another chapter. And that's basically what happened with Ben Bova. He said, you know, he had read some of my short stories and liked them. And so he basically wasn't gambling a lot, a couple $1,000, but he gave me an aiming point, so to speak, a deadline. I had to write a book, so there it was.
Gotcha.
I did write another book meantime, but it wasn't.
Nice. I also wanted to ask, once the Forever War was published, how quickly did it start to like gain traction in terms of, like, I guess, get famous, if you will, after it was published? Was it pretty immediate, or did it take a while for it to kind of make its way into the mainstream?
Well, that's working on a couple of levels, because there's regular publishing and there's science fiction publishing. And within the real small universe of aficionados, it got traction very quickly. And so a lot of people read it and read about it. But the actual mainstream recognition was a couple of years later, after it had won all the awards and everything. The rest of the world said, oh, you know, there's a bunch of noise coming from this little corner. Maybe we should see what's going on. But that's life in publishing.
Right. Right. That makes sense. I also have to consider the fact that, yeah, when it was originally published in the 70s, science fiction was probably a lot more niche than it is today. Whereas I feel like today it's way more mainstream, especially you see so many big Hollywood franchises that are full front and center science fiction now.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Afraid so. That's a good thing and a bad thing, but it's there. It's a thing.
Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But both Star Trek and Star Wars, and so I can't really complain too much about them. But there you go.
Right.
I mean, it's those of us who are true science fiction fans. That kind of mass market stuff is for the proletariat, you know.
That's an old-fashioned attitude.
Very old-fashioned attitude. You may notice I'm an old person.
No, it makes sense. Just going back and reading these classic sci-fi books, they're a lot more audacious, I feel like, in some of the stuff that they're willing to tackle than a lot of the mainstream stuff is now, where they're trying very much to cater to a broad audience, whereas I feel like a lot of the older stuff, they were fine with tackling these very niche or controversial topics head on.
Yeah. Well, you've got to say it works both ways. That is, science fiction and other genre niches are resistant to stylistic experimentation, resistant to extremely subtle writing, and that's just the way it goes. I mean, you can write a science fiction or fantasy novel around the most weird and esoteric ideas, and it just flows through. I mean, go ahead. If you try something weird in terms of point of view, characterization, and so forth, you hit real resistance, and that's just the way it is. I mean, we started out as a small, pretty successful fraction of the trade book market, and as long as you stayed in your territory, you could sell book after book after book, and they didn't have to be that different from each other either. But you know, times change.
Right.
It's harder to me, from my at least from my point of view, it's harder to write a difficult literary novel and get it published than a difficult science fiction or fantasy novel. Because the thing is, you can make a science fiction novel that's really hard to understand completely. But if it's got rocket ships and naked babes on the cover, you're going to sell a certain number of book copies anyhow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, look at that. That babe's an alien, but she's naked.
That's old-fashioned too.
I know. Well, say what you want.
No, I think some of that appeal is very, very much still there, especially with science fiction. Maybe it's not as front and center as it used to be, but I think that appeal is definitely still prevalent.
Yeah, it's a great idea for a book, Jack, but if you can work a naked babe in with the alien, it's a little easier. A naked alien is, what can you say? How many tentacles did she have? I don't care.
Oh no. Right, exactly. So, with the Forever War, also, I wanted to ask, because a lot of people like to compare and contrast the Forever War with Starship Troopers, because it's also very prominent military science fiction, and they have some kind of surface level similarities. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts of, do you think that's a fair comparison, or what do you think about that?
Well, they're both science fiction novels about war.
Yeah.
It's interesting that a fundamental difference between the two is about the authors. Heinlein was never in combat. He was a serious military man. He really wanted to be a military man. Whereas I spent way too much time in combat, and I never wanted to be a soldier. I mean, I really didn't want to be a soldier.
Right.
So we're kind of mirror images of each other. And yet, from the day we met, we liked each other just automatically. And it's a funny thing, but I think that happens often enough. But I greatly respected him. I grew up reading Heinlein, and I never thought I'd meet him. But then suddenly, at this cocktail party, there he was. Wow!
And he got up and came over and introduced himself to Joe and said how much he liked the Forever War, which was just blew Joe away. I wasn't there, but Joe's feet didn't touch the floor again for months.
Yeah,
I'll bet.
He was just, oh, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a huge compliment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had a note about that Heinlein actually wrote you a letter as well after the Forever War won the Nebula and said congratulations. And I can't imagine what that feeling must have been like.
It's great. Yeah. Not just because I said, hey, I can put this in the back of my book.
That's true. Definitely helps with marketability. And then on the subject of meeting other science fiction authors, I had seen other clips that you had gotten to interact with some of the other big names in sci-fi, and I kind of wanted to get a sense of what those were like.
Sure. But that's the nature of science fiction. I mean, it's very democratic and very social. I mean, after I had a couple of books out, and I don't mean famous books or anything, just a couple of books, I was one of the group. You know, you're either an amateur or a professional. And if you have a couple of books out, you're a professional. You may not make any money at it. And maybe you may never get a bunch of readers. But if you sit down at the typewriter constantly, if if you can find a typewriter in some used bookstores,
Dated again.
Yeah, remember, young man, if you're going to be a writer, always keep ink around because you'll never run out of stuff to say if you've got an ink thing. Ink well, we call them wells. Yeah, I got one.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I've got how many of them do I have down here?
15 or 20.
It's just lots of pens.
Nice. Yes, you can never have too many, in my experience.
Right.
We had talked about it a little earlier about some of the big science fiction franchises, and I just wanted to ask you guys, what are some of your favorite sci-fi works, be it books, movies, TV? What do you guys really enjoy?
Oh, most of the things that I would respond to are so old-fashioned that people wouldn't even recognize them, I suppose. But I like some of the new franchises and stuff. Now, the whole idea of a franchise is really past the vast bulk of my reading experience. That's something that just started in the 70s, really, or 60s, late 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my reading tastes are book by book. I don't have groups of things that I like. I'm going to give a chance to anybody. And I've got to say, I don't read as much as I did when I was younger. I might read a couple of books a month. And I used to read a couple a day. But there you go.
I read the nominees for the awards when they come out. And that pretty much keeps me in books, and they're pretty well weeded by then. They're mostly good. Occasionally there's one that I don't like, but mostly they're pretty good books. And Alecki's books, for instance, Naomi Novik, John Scalzi, Jeff Vandermeer, just people who are current and whose books get nominated. I try to read them all. I don't always. I try, and I like to vote in the award things that I'm eligible to vote in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And it's funny you bring up John Scalzi.
But Joe doesn't. Every once in a while I'll say, you got to read this. But
Gotcha. Yeah, no, sorry. All I was going to say was that with John Scalzi, I had read Old Man's War also for the first time this year, and I noticed a lot of similarities that I think he also took a lot of inspiration both from Heinlein as well as from the Forever War also in that book. No,
he said he didn't read it.
He's annoyed because people say that, and he did not read it before he wrote Old Man's War.
But it's a war story.
Funny.
They go way back.
Right. Yeah.
The funny part was he said, I'm not going to read it since everybody's telling me I should. I'm not going to. And then we asked him to do the introduction to a fancy edition of it because we'd become friends by that time. And we had to read it and grudgingly see the comparisons. And he wrote the funniest essay.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful essay on not having read it, but being influenced by it. It was really, really nice. And then Amazon brought out the book with The Forever War by Joe Haldeman and John Scalzi. And John said, but I was only 3 years old.
That's great. That's really funny. I didn't know that backstory.
Yeah, it's cute. And he's become a real good friend. We're very fond of him.
That's great. And yes, he very much, if you ever see him on social media or just in his work in general, he is a very snarky, sarcastic individual, it seems like.
Yeah, but likable.
Very likable.
That's great. I also wanted to ask with the Forever War, it was adapted into a graphic novel at one point, and I've seen images of it online, and I wanted to ask you, I guess, what do you think of graphic novels and comic books in general? What are your thoughts on kind of that media?
Oh, I like them in general. I'm a big comic book reader since I was a kid. And when the Forever War came out as a comic, I was pretty actively involved in converting it or adapting it, whatever you want to say. And I really liked the artist who was doing it. So we had a lot of fun working together.
They did it by fax because there were no computers at that point.
Well, you probably don't know what a fax is, but it's a machine that
and Mark Van Oppen, who is Marvano, who is the artist, is wonderful. And he was in Belgium and we were in Florida, and they just faxed back and forth this, and then he would take Joe's script of it and adapt it to what would make good pictures. I think he did a wonderful job. I'm very fond of that graphic novel.
That's awesome. Yes, I've seen images from it, and if you saw my video, I used images of it in the video just because that art style is very striking and I think captures the spirit of the novel very well.
Yeah.
And then also, I wanted to ask on the same lines of the Forever War being adapted, I had read online that everybody and anybody, it seems like, has tried to get the Forever War adapted to the big screen in some way, whether it be movie or TV. I guess I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you want to see that happen? Are you concerned about that happening? Because I know...
Sure. I want to see it, and I want no, the thing is, that's out of my control.
Right.
The book exists, and who was it? Somebody asked, John Steinbeck, I guess, says, "Are you anxious about Of Mice and Men or something coming out as a movie?" And Steinbeck says, "Why should I care? I've got the money, and the movie can come and go. The book is right here." And he slams his hand down on the bookshelf. He says, "This is where the story is. And if somebody else makes another story that has some, relationship to my book, that's wonderful, especially if I get some money." It's not so wonderful if somebody else gets some money, but there you
go. Right, exactly.
We sold the rights outright, years and years ago for a fair amount of money, which is wonderful. And so we have no control at all. And there have been several scripts, there have been several directors associated, and then it all disappears. One time we heard that they were making a movie because a good friend goes to aerobics class with the secretary to the producer.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't even known it was. Right. I love that story.
But the first time we heard that it was being made into a movie, the rumor monger, the person who told us, was associated with Harry Harrison, a science fiction writer. And I've been friends with Harry a long time, and this was way back. I faxed him. This before you could even, there were transatlantic phones, but they were expensive, and he lived in Ireland. So I faxed him a question, and he wrote back, Joe, I heard about that too, and I've got to tell you, it flew up its own ass and disappeared. Wow. That's the geometry is astounding.
So we have a recent rumor, but nothing to it yet. So
they keep coming and going.
Yeah, the man who owns it apparently is still trying to put deals together, but that's all we know.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And we're not in communication with him at all.
No, haven't been.
He sold that connection 100 years ago.
Well, if they ever do make that movie or series, I really hope
if somebody
it's
wanted to meet up. Yeah. Well,
thank you. We do too.
I hope it's done.
I hope it happens.
Right. Yeah. At least we see something at this point.
Yeah. If it's really an awful job, I can say, well, they really screwed up my book.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And yes, like you said, even if an adaptation is less than successful or doesn't turn out very well, we always have the book to go back to, and that's going to be read on shelves for years, regardless of what Hollywood or whoever does what with it. So, and then I also wanted to ask, I'm sure you get asked this all the time, so forgive me, but as somebody who likes to write science fiction himself and would like to write sci-fi at some point, what is your number one piece of writing advice that you like to give to aspiring authors?
Well, the answer I give them depends on the context. The best writing advice anybody could give you is not listen to advice from anybody else. Because the ideas that you generate from your own life are the ones you can work with. Everything else is secondhand. Now you can study writing, you can study literature, and you can study film writing if you really want to throw money away. But it's what you bring to it that's really important, not what you learn. As I say, I went to the predominant writing school in America is the Iowa Writers Workshop. Now I went there, I got an MFA, and I didn't unlearn anything when I was there. What can you say? I think I'm a natural writer, but I can say that from my track record. I mean, if I had shown up at the door in Iowa City with a tablet and a pencil and said, I want to be a writer, after they stopped laughing, they said, okay, prove it. You've got a pencil, you've got a stack of paper. And that's basically all it is. I mean, anybody can write something of any length, but can't tell until you try. And I guess the advice everybody gives you is true. It's don't let anybody talk you out of it. Because who knows whether you're going to succeed or not. Nobody has a crystal ball or anything. You just happens.
I think the most life-changing advice Joe ever got was from Keith Lummer, the science fiction writer, who said, just sit down and write every day. Actually, he said, put your ass in a chair every day and write. When he started doing that, then things took off.
Right.
But this deserves a footnote.
Yeah.
Which is Keith is not the first person who said that. That was in almost every writing book that I ever wrote.
Said it, you listened, and that's when things started to get really good.
Yeah. Well, Keith was one of many writers who gave me advice. And there are all sorts of object lessons to be had here and there. But one thing that Keith mentioned that was later reinforced by other people who I respected more was to study Boswell and Johnson, the essayists in the 18th century. They didn't even have commercial writing when these guys were writing, but they had to have an audience. They got paid daily if their audience was satisfied, and if they weren't, they stopped getting paid. And so these guys, they're just writing about what's going on around them, and what is going on around them is the largest city in the world, London versus, well, Beijing or whatever they called it in those days was bigger, but so they didn't have to worry about subjects to write about. They just had to open their window, and there was all the world.
Yeah.
And they had an audience, millions of people who were looking for cheap entertainment, which at the time was printed matter. And so they learned fast. And it was a competitive market, and a very intellectual one compared to, mass markets today. So it was, in a way, that was the best lesson that Keith Laumer ever gave me.
That's awesome.
Which was look to London in the 18th century.
Isn't that strange and wonderful?
Right. I also apologize for my poster falling. As you can see, we run a very professional production here behind the scenes.
I'm glad you're influenced by other writers. That's
watercolor by Joe.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, that must be 35, 40 years old.
I think so.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's on the wall, who's going to take it off?
Right.
Up there with the Maori War Club. Let's see, there's a Maori and a black cat coming down. And, there's another Maori thing up there.
That's a fertility symbol, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Gotcha. Nice.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. And then also I wanted to ask, just as I guess kind of a fun question, if you ever had the opportunity to write for one of the big science fiction franchises out there, which one would it be? Or, I mean, would that even interest you?
No, I don't want to write for anybody.
Yeah.
Well, if I were familiar with the franchises, I might say yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've seen, is sort of comic book writing, and well, I have no motivation to write that stuff.
He did write 2 Star Trek novels.
Yeah, I have written very commercial stuff, and I've written comic books, which I enjoy. But I don't know. Right now, it's been years since I wrote anything just for money. At least in the sense of, well, somebody please buy this.
Right. That makes sense. And I also wanted to ask, I have to confess to you, I have not read Forever Free or Forever Peace yet, and I've heard different things, and I wanted to ask you, which is the best order to read it in? Should I read Forever Free first and then Forever Peace, or Forever Peace first and then Forever Free?
Well, I guess if you're going to read them in terms of the storyline's chronology, you want to read Forever Peace and then Forever Free.
Gotcha.
But they were both written long after I finished the Forever War. And in fact, they started out, somebody asked me, I guess a year after the Forever War came out, would you consider writing a sequel to the Forever War? I said, no, why should I? And, why should I is a question that's hard to answer. And I thought about it, and then the next time somebody asked me, I said, okay, I'll give it a try. Because by then the comics world had changed quite a bit. When the Forever War first came out as a graphic novel, I guess there was a notion that perhaps I should write a series of them. It wasn't a compelling trend at the time. A couple of years later, the whole industry was rife with sequels and prequels and trilogies and quadrilogies and septuplologies.
Right.
But it became, the thing is, what was not clear at the time, other people did know this, but I didn't, is that the series novel is a literary entity completely different from the novel. And writing it is a completely different thing. When I wrote those 3 Forever novels, I wrote them as standalone, here's a novel, scratch my head. Yep.
Forever Free is an actual sequel.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's true.
Forever Peace is a standalone, not related except in title.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And it's an award winner too, so you might.
Yeah. Forever War was written, of course, as a standalone piece. And I laughed at people when they said, well, you could do a series about this. And I said, oh, yeah, I'm sure that Ernest Hemingway was told this too. And he said, well, I'll just have to do The Old Man and the Sea and the Fish too. And then, yeah, he did, in fact.
Right. Okay, well that's good to know, and I'm eager to get into the sequels as well. Just because it's a very compelling world that you set up in that book, and I like the characters and just the way the story flows is just very compelling. So
I'm glad. Yeah.
Well, and then if it's okay with you, I had one final question to ask of you. And that was, I wanted to ask for my viewers who have never read The Forever War, coming from both of you, why should they read The Forever War?
I'm running out of money, so you got to go buy it.
Always a good motivation.
Yeah. I think because people still like it after all these years, so there must be something good there.
Right.
As a reader, I would say a standalone novel that is still selling well after a half century must have something going for it. And even if I didn't like it, I would be curious as to why it's still successful.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people who buy it now had never heard of it 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I should say, to preserve some pretense of modesty, that the book itself is sort of a timeless design, called plot or whatever, and it goes back to BC. I mean, it's a lone hero fighting for his life and for his cultural surround. I won't say country, because he wasn't fighting for his country ever.
Right.
And a love interest.
And a love interest.
Yeah.
So, it's a combination of the best qualities of Ulysses and Ulysses in the 20th century. Not really.
Oh, no.
Gotcha. Yes, and I would completely agree that the books that really stand the test of time are the ones that are able to have themes and ideas that are still relevant today, even long after it was originally written. And I do believe that The Forever War is one of those books. Like, when I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, this still relates to where the United States is. This still relates to where the world is today. Those themes of war and sacrifice and what does it mean to have all of this going on. It's very compelling in that way.
Also, somebody grabbed the word "the Forever War" or the phrase "the Forever War" to deal with all the war that we've had for so long, and they started using that in the news. Well, we checked. Joe's the one who coined that. It comes from his book. Dexter Filkins wrote "The Forever War" about the present war, and claims he didn't know there was already a classic science fiction book out there. Somebody asked him, and he said, I do now. We're proud of that. I'm proud of that he's the one who coined that phrase. I'm sorry that our local present one kept on going, but it did.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I wouldn't mind if they gave me royalties for this war, but I mean, how many wars can you profit?
Yes, exactly. All right. Well, that is all the questions I had prepared. Thank you all so much for allowing me this time to talk to you both. It's always great to get an insider's perspective on a book. You don't get an opportunity like this every day. So thank you all for letting me ask you whatever question came to my head.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be of service.
Me too.
Of course. Thank you both. Wish you all the best. And I'll go ahead and end it right here. And you all have a great rest of your day, and was very happy to talk to both of you. Thank you so much.
So glad to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.